Aveline was a woman like no other, a beauty so captivating that the very air seemed to shimmer around her. Her skin was as smooth as ivory, a perfect canvas that seemed to glow under the sun's touch, while her long raven black hair cascaded in waves that danced with the breeze. Her eyes, oh, her eyes, held a brilliance that could rival the stars themselves, glistening like dewdrops on a morning leaf, full of mystery and depth. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that mesmerized. It was something deeper, something unspoken in the way she carried herself. Her presence had a gravity to it that drew people in, both men and women alike. The men, often enchanted by her charm, found themselves forgetting their names and losing their senses in her presence. She was a force, a living enchantment. But Aveline, unlike most women, had never sought admiration for her looks. She walked through the village as if the attention didn't faze her, smiling politely, but never allowing anyone to get too close. She was often the subject of whispered gossip in the marketplace, where traders paused mid-bargain, unable to finish their negotiations, their eyes glued to her as she passed. The birds seemed to stop their songs, as if the very earth held its breath when she walked by. She was the village's greatest treasure, the object of every man's desire. Yet she remained untouched, a mystery wrapped in layers of grace. While the villagers admired her, the women were envious, some even bitter. Such beauty is dangerous, they would murmur, shaking their heads as they watched Aveline stroll by. But it wasn't envy alone that drove these whispers. It was fear. Aveline knew the power she wielded over the hearts of men, and she understood the consequences it could bring. There was a rule she lived by, one she had enforced since her youth: no touching before marriage. It wasn't about virtue or the ideas of morality that most women held dear. It wasn't about upholding purity in the traditional sense. For Aveline, it was far more personal. She had carried a secret, a deep, dark secret, her whole life, one that no one could know, not even the man she would eventually marry. Her secret was her curse. The moment a man touched her, when his hands brushed against her skin, when his lips met hers, it would begin a slow, dreadful transformation. Aveline knew that if a man were to truly see her, see what lay hidden beneath her beauty, his life would be ruined, not by anything she did consciously, but by the forces she could not control, the forces that had been placed upon her from birth. She had learned from an early age that her beauty came at a cost, a heavy price, and no matter how deeply she longed for love, she could never allow herself to be touched. It was a strange fate to carry, this gift that made her both the most desired and the most isolated person in the village. For Aveline, there was no happiness in the looks of admiration or the flattering words spoken behind her back. What good were they if the touch of love was forbidden to her? What worth was there in beauty that kept her locked away in a cage, unable to share herself with the world? Yet she had learned to accept her fate, to embrace the loneliness that came with it. She smiled. She laughed. She allowed them to admire her from a distance, but she kept them at arm's length. And that was how she lived in peace, with only her secret to bear. Then one day, everything changed. He arrived. Maxwell, the young man from the neighboring town, was different from the others. There was something in his eyes, something genuine and sincere, that Aveline had never seen before. He was charming, handsome, and he didn't fall victim to the usual distractions of wealth or status. When he first saw her, standing by the village stream, his heart skipped a beat. and for the first time in Aveline's life, she felt herself drawn to someone in a way that made her heart flutter. He didn't worship her beauty, he admired her soul, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love could still find its way to her. But Aveline's rules stood firm. She reminded Maxwell, as she had every man before him, that there would be no physical closeness until they were married. She warned him, and he, in his earnestness, agreed. It was a challenge for him, but Maxwell was different from the others. He respected her wishes, gave her space, and waited. He courted her in the way that only a man truly in love can. A love that wasn't based on her beauty alone, but on the person she was, deep down. The villagers watched, intrigued by this new suitor, whispering that perhaps Aveline's heart would finally be won. The days turned into months, and the bond between them grew stronger. They laughed together, shared stories, and walked through the village where the people began to wonder if the curse could finally be broken. Maxwell proposed, and for the first time, Aveline found herself saying yes. It was a decision she knew would change everything, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The wedding day arrived with a brightness that seemed to rival the sun. The village buzzed with excitement, the air thick with the scent of flowers and roasting meats. Aveline, dressed in a gown that shimmered like the morning dew, walked down the aisle, her heart heavy with both anticipation and dread. Maxwell stood at the altar, his eyes shining with love and devotion. He had waited for this moment patiently, without ever once questioning her boundaries. To him, Aveline was the epitome of grace, a woman whose beauty was matched only by the purity of her heart. As she reached his side, he smiled, his hand reaching out to take hers, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. The vows were exchanged, the rings slipped onto their fingers, and the village erupted in cheers. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Aveline's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of her secret pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She had known this moment would come. She had been preparing for it all her life, yet the fear still gripped her. What would happen once Maxwell touched her? What would happen when their wedding night came? As the evening stretched on and the guests began to leave, the couple made their way to their private chamber. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting long shadows on the walls. Aveline could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as Maxwell turned to her with that look of pure longing in his eyes. "My love," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with an undeniable hunger. "Tonight is ours. You are mine now, and I am yours." Aveline's heart skipped a beat. She had spent so many years keeping men at arm's length, always pushing them away when their touch threatened to expose her secret. But Maxwell had been different. Maxwell had been different. He had respected her boundaries, loved her from afar, and waited patiently for this night. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the fear that had haunted her for so long. What if he was the one who couldn't survive the curse? What if, in that one moment, everything would be destroyed? He took a step closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently lift her veil. She stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Maxwell smiled softly, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "We are meant to be together. I have waited for this night, and I will love you gently, just as I've always promised." Aveline swallowed hard, trying to steady her trembling hands. She knew there was no turning back. This was it. She could no longer hide. Hesitantly, she allowed him to pull her close, feeling the heat of his body against hers. Her heart raced, a mix of excitement and terror flooding her senses. As he leaned down to kiss her, her mind screamed in warning. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. The moment his lips touched her skin, the world seemed to explode into chaos. Maxwell's body tensed, his hands clutching at her, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. His eyes widened in horror, and then with a loud, agonizing scream, he staggered back. Aveline gasped, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him collapse to the floor. "What's happening?" she cried, rushing to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake. But Maxwell wasn't responding. His hands were clutching his face, and his mouth opened and closed as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. His eyes, wide with terror, stared at her, but they were empty, blind. Aveline's blood ran cold as she watched the man she loved fall into a state of shock. She could feel the darkness rising within her, the terrible curse she had feared her entire life unfolding before her eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't happen. "Maxwell," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Maxwell, what's wrong? What happened?" But he didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His eyes were sealed shut, his body shaking uncontrollably, as if gripped by an unseen force. Panic rose in Aveline's chest, her hands flying to his face, but nothing she did could bring him back. The world around her seemed to spin as she desperately tried to understand what had gone wrong. The room filled with the sound of footsteps as the door burst open, and the villagers, alerted by Maxwell's screams, rushed in. They saw him on the floor, blind and gasping for air, and their eyes immediately turned to Aveline. She stood there, trembling, helpless, her face pale with fear. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted anyone to suffer because of her, but it was too late. Maxwell's eyes remained closed, his world forever darkened by the curse she had carried with her all her life. Aveline could only stand there, paralyzed by guilt and fear, as the villagers murmured in disbelief. The curse was real. It was no longer a whispered legend, a myth told in hushed voices. It was here in front of them, and it had taken the life of the man Aveline had once thought she could love. And so she fled. Aveline fled into the night, her heart shattered and her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The sound of Maxwell's screams still echoed in her ears, his terrified cries haunting her every step as she ran through the darkened village. She couldn't stop, couldn't face the villagers who were surely already whispering about her, calling her cursed, the cause of Maxwell's misfortune. Her feet hit the dirt path with a frantic rhythm as she left the village behind, the flickering lights of the houses fading into the distance. The world felt like it was closing in on her, but she kept running, as if somehow, if she ran far enough, she could outrun the curse that had been chasing her entire life. Her escape took her deep into the surrounding forest, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist into strange, unrecognizable shapes. Aveline barely noticed the cold night air biting at her skin or the sharp branches scratching at her face as she stumbled through the underbrush. All she could think about was Maxwell, his screams, his agony, the horrible truth that she had known would one day come to pass. She had feared this moment her entire life, and now that it had happened, There was no turning back. The curse had claimed another victim, and it was her fault. She had tried to protect herself, tried to keep everyone at a distance, but love had finally broken through, and now the man she loved was blind, lost to the very thing she had spent so many years running from. The forest seemed endless, stretching out before her in all directions. She had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming urge to escape the shame and horror that clung to her like a second skin. She had no family left to turn to, no home to return to. The village would never accept her now. She was a pariah, a woman whose mere presence brought destruction. Even her own father had abandoned her when she needed him most. Aveline had once believed that love could conquer all, that perhaps someday she would find someone who would see beyond her beauty, beyond the curse, and love her for who she truly was. But now, that hope seemed like a distant, naive dream. As the hours passed, the forest grew darker, colder, and more oppressive. Aveline's legs began to ache, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She had run so far, but she was still no closer to escaping the nightmare she had been born into. She collapsed beneath a towering oak tree, her body trembling with exhaustion. Tears, long held back, finally spilled from her eyes as she curled into herself, her sobs echoing in the emptiness of the forest. She had never felt so alone, so broken. The weight of her curse had always been with her, but never before had it felt so heavy, so suffocating. It had stolen everything from her family, her chance at love, her hope for a future. Now, it seemed, it had claimed her soul as well. But just as she thought she might drown in the sorrow that threatened to consume her, she heard a sound, soft at first, then louder. Footsteps, the crunch of leaves underfoot. Aveline tensed, instinctively drawing herself into a tighter ball. She had grown used to being alone in the world, but the sound of someone approaching her in the darkness filled her with dread. Was it the villagers? Had they come to find her, to punish her for what she had done to Maxwell? Or was it something worse, some dark force sent to claim her for good? But then a voice cut through the silence. It was low, soothing, and unfamiliar. "Child, are you lost?" the voice asked gently. Aveline looked up, her tear-filled eyes struggling to focus in the dim light. Standing before her was an old woman, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and knowing. The woman's presence felt oddly comforting, as if she had stepped out of the very earth itself, like a part of the very earth itself, like a part of the forest that had come to life. Aveline opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't explain herself, couldn't make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that churned within her. Instead, she simply nodded, too exhausted to argue. The old woman studied her for a moment, then knelt beside her, her hands warm as they gently cupped Aveline's face. "You carry a curse," the woman said, her voice soft but certain. "But not the one you think." Aveline's breath caught in her chest. How could this woman know? How could anyone know the truth about her, the secret she had carried for so long? "What do you mean?" Aveline whispered, her voice shaking. The woman smiled, though it was a sad, knowing smile. "You were cursed." "Yes," she said, "but not by fate, not by your own doing. Someone else did this to you, long ago. Someone else did this to you, long ago. Someone who was afraid of your power." Aveline stared at her in disbelief. Was this woman speaking the truth? Could there be a way to break the curse? Could she ever be free? The old woman's eyes gleamed with an ancient wisdom. I can help you, she said, but you must first accept the truth of what was done to you. Only then can you find the strength to set yourself free. Aveline didn't know what to believe anymore, but for the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of hope. Aveline's journey through the forest had led her to a place of unexpected revelation. She had spent countless years running from her curse, trying to shield herself and others from the pain it caused. But here, in the quiet solitude of the woods, she had met a woman who seemed to hold the answers to everything that had haunted her. The old woman's words, though soft, echoed with a certainty that sent a shiver down Aveline's spine. You carry a curse, she had said, but not the one you think. Aveline's heart had been heavy with sorrow, a weight she had never been able to shake. For as long as she could remember, her beauty had been both a gift and a curse, drawing people to her only to destroy them. She had always believed that she was somehow flawed, that the curse was a part of who she was, something inescapable that she could never outrun. But now, as she looked into the wise eyes of the woman before her, something shifted. Could it really be true? Could she have been cursed by someone else, someone who had never wanted her to find happiness? The old woman's gentle touch lingered on Aveline's face as she continued, her voice a soft whisper of truth. You were just a child when they did this to you. Your stepmother, she could not stand your beauty, your purity. So she sought out someone darker, someone who knew the old ways, the ways of curses and shadows. She did it out of jealousy, out of fear. She wanted to destroy you before you could ever truly live. The words felt like a cold wind on Aveline's skin. Her stepmother, the woman who had always looked at her with disdain, as if she were an obstacle in her own path to power, to control. Aveline had always known there was something off about her, something cruel, hidden beneath the veneer of politeness. But hearing it spoken aloud was a different matter. It was hard to accept that the woman who had raised her, who had been a mother figure in her life, had been the one to place such a dreadful burden upon her. Aveline's breath caught in her throat as the realization sank in. She had been cursed by her own blood. The very person who should have cared for her, who should have cared for her, who should have loved her, had instead chosen to ruin her life out of envy. Aveline had always felt a deep, gnawing loneliness, but now it made sense. It was never about her. It was about the jealousy of others. The curse wasn't her fault. It wasn't because she was inherently evil or flawed. It was because someone had wanted to break her, to destroy her before she even had a chance to experience love. The old woman continued, her voice steady as she laid out the truth. The sorceress your stepmother consulted, she gave her a potion, a dark, potent magic. The curse was placed on you when you were just a baby. It made you untouchable, made your beauty both a blessing and a curse. You were meant to never know love, to never be touched by the warmth of another person's affection without bringing destruction in return. Aveline felt a deep ache in her chest. She had spent so many years believing that her beauty was the reason she was alone, that the power it held over others was a reflection of her own inner darkness. But now she saw it differently. The curse had never been about her at all. It had always been about the people who feared her, the people who couldn't stand to see her thrive. Her stepmother had seen Aveline as a threat, someone who could overshadow her own children, someone who could steal the attention, the love that she so desperately craved. Years, the pain that had built up inside her. All these years, she had believed she was the problem, that her own nature had somehow caused the suffering of the men who had come into her life. She had thought that she was destined to be alone, that she had to live with the consequences of the curse. But now, the truth was different. The curse was not her doing. It was a weapon used against her by someone who wanted to keep her powerless, alone. The old woman's eyes softened with empathy. You've been carrying this weight for far too long, child. You've been hiding from the truth, trying to protect yourself and others from something that was never your fault. But now you know, and with that knowledge comes the power to break free. Aveline stared at the woman, feeling the stirrings of something deep within her. The fear, the guilt, the shame. It all seemed to melt away in the face of this truth. She wasn't the villain of her own story. She was a victim, and now she had a chance to reclaim her life, to fight back against the curse that had ruled her for so long. She stood up, feeling the strength returning to her body, her resolve hardening. I will make it right, she said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. I will break this curse. I will break this curse. I will take back my life. The old woman smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. Then let the journey begin, child. The truth has been revealed. Now it's time for you to find your way. Aveline's heart was no longer weighed down by the darkness of her past. The old woman's words had unlocked something within her, a new sense of clarity and determination. For the first time in her life, she felt the possibility of freedom. Freedom from the curse that had shackled her since birth. Freedom from the fear and shame that had kept her isolated. The road ahead was still unclear, but she knew one thing for sure. She would not let her past define her any longer. She would fight to break the curse, to reclaim her life, and to find a future that was truly hers. With newfound resolve, Aveline made her way back to the village. The journey was not an easy one. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt like an obstacle standing between her and the truth. Every step she took felt like a battle against the memories that haunted her of Maxwell, of Darius, of the men whose lives had been ruined by the curse she had never chosen. But as the days passed and the road to the village grew nearer, Aveline found herself growing stronger, more certain of her path. When she finally arrived, the village looked different. It was the same place she had grown up in, but it no longer felt like home. The people who had once admired her beauty now looked at her with suspicion, with whispers that traveled faster than the wind. She could feel their eyes on her as she passed, the judgment in their gaze, the way they murmured about her, the woman who had cursed the men who had loved her. But Aveline did not falter. She had come back for one reason: to confront the truth, to face the past, and to break the chains that had bound her for so long. The village square was quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Aveline walked into the center, standing tall, despite the weight of the years that had shaped her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run away all those months ago. She was a woman now, one who knew the power of her own strength, one who had finally accepted the truth of her past. The elders, who had once cast her out, were gathered in their usual place, speaking in hushed tones. When they saw her, their faces hardened with disbelief. Aveline, the chief elder, said, his voice rough, "What are you doing here? You are no longer one of us. You are banished for a reason. Aveline met his gaze without hesitation. I've come for justice, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. I've come for the truth. The villagers gathered around, murmuring among themselves. Some stared at her with fear, others with curiosity, but none of them spoke, not yet. Aveline turned to face the elders. Her eyes locked onto their faces, and she said the words that would change everything. You cursed me, she declared, her voice ringing through the silence. You, and especially my stepmother. You took my life from me before I even had the chance to live it. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, but Aveline stood firm, unshaken by their disbelief. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying guilt they had long kept hidden. Aveline's stepmother, Mama Chidi, was there, her face pale, her hands trembling. Aveline's heart burned with the truth she had kept locked away for so long. You sought out a sorceress to curse me, she said, her voice sharp. You wanted me to suffer. You wanted me to never know love, to never be touched without causing destruction. But it was never my fault. It was never my curse to bear. The crowd fell silent. The weight of Aveline's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Mama Chidi, the woman who had once been so powerful, so feared, now stood before her, unable to meet her eyes. The curse, the source of Aveline's suffering, was finally out in the open. But Aveline didn't stop there. She turned to the old woman who had followed her to the village and gestured for her to step forward. The woman held out a small pouch, its contents spilling out onto the ground. Dark powder, the same powder that had been used to curse Aveline all those years ago. The proof was undeniable. You see, the old woman said, her voice steady. This is the powder that was used to place the curse on Aveline. This is the evidence that proves she was a victim, not the villain. The crowd gasped. Mama Chidi's face drained of color, and the other elders took a step back, their eyes wide with fear. They could no longer deny the truth. The curse had never been Aveline's doing. It had been the work of those who had feared her, those who had wanted to control her, those who had wanted to control her. Mama Chidi collapsed to her knees, her face twisted in terror. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. Forgive me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But it was too late for forgiveness. The villagers had seen the truth, and they could no longer ignore the injustice that had been done. One by one, they turned away from Mama Chidi, the woman who had caused so much pain. And as the elders finally admitted their role in the curse, they too were cast out, just as Aveline had once been. In that moment, Aveline felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The curse was broken, the truth revealed. But the journey was far from over. She had faced her past, confronted her demons, and broken free from the chains that had bound her. Now it was time to rebuild. She had fought for her life, for the right to love and be loved, and she would no longer let fear or guilt control her. Aveline's future was hers to shape, and for the first time, she saw a horizon filled with hope. Aveline stood at the edge of the village, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in the sight before her. The streets she had once known so well were now foreign, filled with echoes of memories, some beautiful, others too painful to bear. Her childhood home, the place where she had been raised, now felt like a distant dream, a place she could never truly return to. The faces of the villagers, once filled with admiration, now looked at her with fear and suspicion. The truth about her curse had spread like wildfire, and she could feel the weight of their gazes on her as they watched her every move. It was as if she were an outsider in her own world, a woman who had been branded by a curse that was never truly hers to carry. But Aveline didn't flinch. She didn't turn away from the stares or the whispers that followed her every step. She had faced so much worse in her life. The pain, the isolation, the guilt of believing she had destroyed the men who had loved her. She had survived the curse, the years of running from the truth, and now she was ready to rebuild her life. The village had cast her out once, and now it was her turn to leave. But this time, she wasn't running away in fear. She was walking away with her head held high, with the knowledge that she had finally broken the chains that had held her captive for so long. As she walked through the village for the last time, the memories flooded back. The laughter of the children, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, the sounds of music and celebration during festivals. It all seemed like a lifetime ago. But there was no place for her here anymore. The villagers had made their judgment. They had seen her as a curse, as a dangerous force that could never truly belong. And despite the truth being revealed, the damage had been done. Their fear, their suspicion, could not be undone in an instant. Aveline reached the edge of the village, where the dirt road stretched out before her, winding through the hills and into the unknown. The forest loomed ahead, its dark trees seeming to whisper her name, calling her to step into the unknown. It was a place of mystery, a place where she had once found solace during the darkest days of her life. Now it felt like a sanctuary, a fresh start. She had no idea where this road would lead, but for the first time, she didn't need to. She wasn't searching for anything anymore. She wasn't looking for love or acceptance or redemption. She had found all of that within herself. With a deep breath, Aveline stepped onto the path, leaving behind the village that had shaped her, for better or for worse. The weight in her chest began to lift as she walked away, and though she couldn't see it, she felt the freedom that lay ahead. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, the parts she had hidden away for so long, and now she was free to move forward. Days turned into weeks as Aveline journeyed through forests, across rivers, and over hills. The road was not easy, and at times it felt as though the world itself was testing her resolve. But she was stronger now. Every step she took was a step away from the fear and shame that had held her captive for so long. The world was wide, and for the first time, she felt like she could explore it without looking over her shoulder, without the weight of a curse dragging her down. And then one evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Aveline came across a small village nestled at the edge of a quiet valley. The houses were simple but warm, the air filled with the sounds of people living their lives. For the first time in a long while, Aveline felt a spark of hope flicker within her. This place was different. It didn't feel like a place to hide. It felt like a place to begin again. She found a small cottage at the edge of the village, a place where she could rest, heal, and start anew. The villagers greeted her with warmth and curiosity, not with fear or suspicion. They saw her not as a woman marked by a curse, but as someone looking to find peace. She settled into the quiet rhythms of village life, helping the farmers in the fields, mending clothes for the children, and sharing stories with the elders. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a life she had chosen, a life free from the chains of her past. Over time, Aveline began to heal. The pain of her past slowly faded as she built new memories, new connections, and new relationships. The love that had once seemed impossible, the kind of love she had believed was out of reach, began to blossom in small, unexpected ways. She no longer saw herself as cursed. She saw herself as someone who had survived, someone who had broken free. And in that freedom, she found something even more powerful: peace. Years passed, and Aveline grew stronger. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkness, and she had faced the darkness, and she had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came. The curse was gone, the past was behind her, and the future, her future, was hers to shape. Years passed, and the quiet village nestled in the valley became Aveline's sanctuary, the place where she could finally breathe without the constant shadow of her past hanging over her. The seasons changed, the flowers bloomed and withered, and the villagers around her continued with their lives, each day a little bit brighter than the last. But for Aveline, it wasn't just the passage of time that healed her. It was the small acts of kindness, the simple pleasures that made her feel whole again. She worked the land, tended to the sick, and helped the children with their studies. With each passing day, the pain that had once defined her began to fade, replaced by the warmth of acceptance and belonging. Though her days were filled with work and routine, Aveline couldn't help but feel the stirring of something new inside her. The first flicker of hope had been fragile, but now it was growing, blossoming into something that felt real, something she hadn't allowed herself to dream of in so long. She had never thought she could truly be loved, never thought anyone could look at her without seeing the curse that had once haunted her. But now, with each passing year, she began to realize that the love she had once feared was not impossible. It was just different. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, she met him. His name was Elias. He was a quiet man, with eyes that seemed to see the world in a way that few could understand. He was a wanderer, someone who had come from a far-off land, seeking solace in the simplicity of village life. He had heard whispers of Aveline, the woman who had once been cursed, the one who had walked away from everything to start anew. But when he had walked at her, he saw only a woman, not a... He saw strength, resilience, and a quiet beauty that radiated from within, not the remnants of a curse. Their first meeting was simple enough. Aveline had been helping a farmer in the fields when Elias approached her, asking for directions to the inn. There was nothing extraordinary about their exchange, yet when their eyes met, something shifted. It was as if the universe had paused for just a moment, allowing them to find one another. She noticed the way he spoke with such kindness, the way he listened when others would have already turned away. His presence felt like a balm to her tired soul, and for the first time in many years, Aveline allowed herself to feel the stirrings of something she had long buried: affection, curiosity, and even, perhaps, hope. Over the next few weeks, Elias became a fixture in Aveline's life. He would visit her in the mornings, bringing with him tales of distant lands and adventures. They would sit under the large oak tree at the village's edge, sipping tea as the sun filtered through the leaves. Aveline found herself laughing again, something she hadn't truly done in so long. There was a gentleness in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made her feel safe. He never once mentioned her past, never once alluded to the curse that had once alluded to the curse that had once defined her. Instead, he saw her for who she was in that moment, the woman who had fought to rebuild her life, the woman who had overcome her fears and emerged stronger. As the seasons turned, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. They shared their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Elias spoke of the places he had seen, the people he had met, but when he talked about Aveline, his words were always full of admiration. He would speak of her strength, her kindness, and the way she had taken the world's weight upon her shoulders and kept walking forward. Aveline, for her part, found herself captivated by him, not just for his stories, but for the way he saw her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not for her beauty or her curse, but for who she had become. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Elias took her hand in his touch warm and gentle. "Aveline," he said softly, his voice low, "I've come to realize that it's not your past that defines you. I've come to realize that it's not your past that defines you. It's how you move forward." Aveline's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She had never allowed herself to believe that someone could love her, really love her. She had built walls around her heart, afraid that anyone who came too close would only be hurt by the curse, would only be hurt by the curse she had carried for so long. But with Elias, those walls began to crumble. He didn't see her as a victim of her past. He saw her as a woman who had conquered it. Tears welled up in Aveline's eyes as she squeezed his hand. The love she had once believed was out of reach, now blossoming between them. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she whispered. "I never thought I could be loved without fear, without guilt." Elias smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You are worthy of love, Aveline. You've always been worthy." In that moment, Aveline knew that she had finally found the freedom she had been searching for. The curse was no longer a part of her life, no longer a part of her life, no longer a shadow that loomed over her every step. She was free to love, free to be loved, and for the first time, she allowed herself to embrace the future that was unfolding before her. Aveline's life had changed beyond recognition. She had rebuilt her existence, layer by layer, in a quiet village far from the one she had once known. The curse that had haunted her for so long was no longer a specter in the background, but a distant memory, a part of her past she had left behind. With Elias by her side, the world seemed to open up in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. He had shown her what it was like to truly love and be loved without the weight of fear or guilt. The walls she had built around her heart, once impenetrable, were now crumbling, brick by brick, under the warmth of his affection. As the days grew longer and the seasons continued their gentle dance, Aveline's bond with Elias deepened. It wasn't just his kindness or his ability to see her for who she truly was, but the way he believed in her, believed in them. For so many years she had doubted herself, unsure of her place in the world, constantly carrying the invisible burden of a curse that she had never asked for. But with Elias, there was no judgment, there was no shame. There was only a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that they had both walked through their own personal hells and emerged stronger for it. One crisp autumn evening, as the orange and gold leaves drifted lazily from the trees, Elias took Aveline's hand in his as they walked along the quiet path that led through the village. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sound of their footsteps was the only noise that broke the peaceful silence. Aveline smiled softly, her heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. It was the first time in years she had felt truly at peace, her past no longer a weight that threatened to crush her at every turn. Elias, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I never thought I could feel like this again. I never thought I could trust anyone. Not like this. Not after everything. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and lavender. I used to think I was broken, that no one would ever love me because of what I'd been through, because of what I carried. Elias stopped and turned to her, lifting her chin gently with his fingers. His gaze was steady and warm, the kind of look that made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered. Aveline, he said softly, you were never broken. You were never the curse you thought you were. You were always strong, always capable of loving and being loved. You just needed to find someone who would see you for who you truly are. His words pierced through the layers of doubt that still lingered in her heart, reminding her of everything she had overcome. She had spent so many years thinking of herself as a victim, as someone defined by the curse placed upon her at birth. But now, with Elias by her side, she realized that the curse had never been her identity. It had been a challenge, a trial she had survived, and in surviving, she had become someone entirely new. I never thought it was possible, Aveline murmured, but now I see that love is possible. Real love, not the kind of love I thought I had to hide from. Not the kind that was tainted by the curse, but the kind of love that is free, that doesn't come with conditions. She smiled, her eyes filled with unshed tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Thank you for showing me that. Elias smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You don't have to thank me, he said, pulling her close, wrapping his arms around her. I'm the lucky one. I've always known that you were something special, even before you saw it yourself. Aveline's heart fluttered at his words, and in that moment, she knew that she had found something precious, a love that wasn't tainted by fear, a love that was not bound by the past. The years of running, the years of hiding from herself were finally behind her. She had finally found the peace she had longed for, and it was here in this quiet village with Elias, the man who loved her not for her beauty, not for her past, but for the woman she had become. Aveline turned to Elias, who stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. He had been with her through it all, through the pain, the heartbreak, and the long, lonely years of wondering if she would ever find peace. He had never wavered in his belief in her, in their love. She felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him, but also a quiet sense of responsibility. He had shown her a love she had never thought possible, but now it was time for her to show him the depth of that love in return. She couldn't stay in the safety of this village forever. There was a world beyond, a world she had to face, and she couldn't do it without confronting the truth. I need to go back, Aveline said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke the words out loud for the first time. I need to go back to the place where it all started, to the village, to the people I left behind. Elias looked at her, his brow furrowing with concern. Are you sure, after everything that happened? After everything you've been through? Aveline nodded, her eyes unwavering. I've spent so many years running from it, hiding from what happened. But I can't keep doing that. I have to face them. I have to face the truth of what was done to me and what I've done to others. It's the only way I can truly be free. Elias took a step forward, pulling her into his arms, his warmth a comfort that steadied her resolve. You don't have to do this alone, he whispered into her hair. I'll go with you, Aveline. Wherever you go, I will be there. You've already proven your strength. You don't need to face the past alone. The promise in his voice made her heart swell with gratitude, but deep down, she knew this was something she had to do for herself. Elias could walk beside her, but it was her own journey to complete. It wasn't just about confronting the village. It was about confronting the woman she had become and understanding that she was no longer the girl haunted by a curse. She was a woman who had survived, who had rebuilt herself, and who now had the power to shape her future, no matter the pain of the past. The journey back to the village was long, but it wasn't the same journey she had once made. This time, there was no fear in her heart. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. As they approached the familiar roads, Aveline felt the weight of the years lifting from her shoulders. She could almost see the past receding behind her, like the shadow of a storm fading into the horizon. And as the village came into view, she knew that no matter what awaited her, she was ready. Ready to face the people who had once seen her as a threat. Ready to confront the memories that had haunted her. Ready to find closure and to finally step into the life she had always deserved. The village had changed, but so had she. And for the first time in years, Aveline felt a sense of peace settle over her. The curse was gone. The past no longer had the power to control her, and the future stretched before her like an open field, waiting to be explored. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by who she had become, and that was enough. Aveline had spent years running from the remnants of her past, and now, standing at the threshold of the village she had once called home, she knew that the time had come to face it. The weight of her journey had been long and painful, but it had also led her to this point of clarity. She wasn't the girl who had been cursed, locked away by a force she couldn't control. She was a woman who had fought for her freedom, for the life she had always deserved, and she was ready to reclaim that right once and for all. But this time, there would be no running. As she and Elias approached the village square, Aveline felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear and excitement. The village had changed since she left, but it had also stayed the same. The cobbled streets, the wooden houses, the familiar faces of the villagers, though they no longer held the same meaning for her, they were still a part of her history. And whether she liked it or not, she would have to face them now. The whispers had started the moment she entered the square, her name carried on the wind, but it wasn't the same as before. The curiosity, the gossip, was now tinged with something else, a sense of uncertainty, of wonder. She had walked away from the village in shame. Her head hung low, but now she returned with her head high, a woman with purpose and a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Elias stood beside her, his presence unwavering, a reminder that she was no longer alone. As they walked through the village, the once familiar faces of her neighbors turned toward her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Some whispered behind their hands, others stared outright, their eyes filled with confusion. It was clear that her return had shaken something deep within them. It wasn't just the return of a woman they thought had disappeared. It was the return of a woman who had broken the curse, who had found a way to escape the chains that had once bound her. Aveline made her way toward the village center, where the elders sat in their usual spot, their faces weary and lined with age. She could feel the tension in the air as the villagers gathered, their whispers rising in volume, their eyes darting between her and the group of elders. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't falter. This was her moment. The truth that had been buried for so long needed to be told. As she approached the elders, the chief elder stood, his face hardening as he saw her approach. The years of guilt were etched into his features, the knowledge that they had been part of a system that had wronged her. Aveline's gaze never wavered. "I've come back to claim what was stolen from me," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "I've come to face the truth that you tried to bury, to confront the curse that you placed upon me, and to take back my life." The villagers fell silent. Aveline could hear the rustle of the leaves in the trees, the distant calls of birds, but in the center of the village, everything was still. The elders exchanged glances. The elders exchanged glances, their eyes clouded with regret. They knew the truth now, just as she had always known it. What had happened to her? What had been done to her as a child? The sorceress, the curse, the manipulation. It had all come from within these walls. Aveline wasn't just the victim of a magical curse. She was the victim of fear and jealousy. And now it was time to make it right. "I know the truth," Aveline continued, her voice growing stronger. "I know it was my stepmother who cursed me, who sought out a sorceress to make sure I would never know love. I know it was the fear of my beauty, of my potential, that made you all turn away from me. But I'm not that girl anymore. I'm not the victim of your fear and lies. I've broken the curse. I've rebuilt my life. And now I'm standing here, not as someone you should fear, but as someone who deserves justice." The chief elder's face turned pale, and the other villagers who had gathered to watch stood frozen, some with their hands clasped in front of them, others with their heads lowered in shame. Aveline could see the ripple of realization pass through them, as if they were beginning to understand what had really happened to her. It wasn't just a story of a beautiful woman cursed by fate. It was a story of a woman broken by the cruelty of those who couldn't stand her light. The chief elder spoke at last, his voice quiet, but tinged with sorrow. "We were wrong," he said, his words heavy with regret. "We did not see the truth. We allowed fear to rule our actions, and in doing so we destroyed you. We destroyed what could have been." Aveline nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. "It's too late for apologies," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But it's not too late for justice. For the first time, I can say that I am free. I have fought for my life, for my happiness, and now I can move forward. But you must understand, what you did was wrong, and it can never be undone. The curse has been broken, but the scars remain." The villagers stood in silence, the weight of her words settling over them. And as Aveline turned to leave, her hand in Elias's, she knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. But for the first time, she felt like she was truly walking forward into a future that was hers to create. The days after Aveline's confrontation with the village elders were filled with a kind of calm that she had never truly experienced before. Her life had always been marked by tension, uncertainty, and the heavy weight of her past. But now, for the first time in years, the air around her seemed lighter. The villagers, though still uncertain and hesitant, had begun to regard her with a mix of respect and awe, as if witnessing her strength had made them question the very foundation of their fears and beliefs. Aveline knew that their perception of her would never fully heal overnight, but she also understood that true change required time and understanding. Elias, as he always had, stood beside her through it all. His unwavering support had been her anchor, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. He had never once asked her to hide from her past or to erase the memories that had shaped her. Instead, he encouraged her to confront them head on, to embrace who she had become and who she was still becoming. As they spent more time together, working side by side, learning from each other, Aveline felt a deep sense of gratitude and affection toward him. His love had been the most healing force she had ever known, a love that didn't judge, that didn't fear the scars of her past, but instead embraced them as part of her journey. As time passed, Aveline began to feel a longing deep within her heart, a desire to build something lasting, something that could serve as a testament to how far she had come. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of fear and uncertainty, always on the run, always wondering when the other shoe would drop. But now, she had the freedom to dream, to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by the past, but instead by her own choices, her own strength. It was a frightening prospect, to let go of the comfort of what she had known and step into something new. But it was also exhilarating. She and Elias began talking more seriously about what their future might look like. Their love had flourished in the quiet moments of life, but Aveline knew that if they were to truly build something together, they would need a foundation. Together, they started working on a piece of land on the outskirts of the village, a patch of earth that had been untouched for years. Aveline had always felt a connection to the land, as if the soil beneath her feet had witnessed her struggles and triumphs and was waiting for her to nurture it back to life. They cleared the land, built a small cottage, and planted seeds, both in the earth and in their hearts. Every day, they worked together, their shared laughter echoing through the fields as they created a home, a life that was wholly their own. There were moments of doubt, of course. There were days when the past crept back in, when the memories of her curse, of the men who had suffered because of her, resurfaced like ghosts she couldn't fully shake. But every time that happened, Elias was there to remind her that those were not the defining moments of her life. "You are not what has happened to you," he would say, his voice gentle but firm. "You are who you choose to be today, and every day that comes after." And slowly, over time, the village began to change as well. The people who had once whispered behind her back, who had viewed her as a danger, began to see her in a different light. They saw the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, who had learned to love without fear, who had taken the broken pieces of her life and turned them into something beautiful. The walls of suspicion began to crumble, and while some still looked at her with doubt, many more began to accept that Aveline was not just a survivor, but a person worthy of love and respect. Aveline had been running for so long, running from the curse, from the guilt, from the shame. But now, as she stood on the land she had nurtured with Elias by her side, she realized that she had finally stopped running. She had found a place to call her own, a place where she could plant roots, where she could build a future that was entirely hers. The curse was no longer a part of her life. The ghosts of the past no longer held her captive. And for the first time, Aveline felt truly free. She looked at Elias, the man who had loved her without condition, without fear, and she knew that together they could face whatever came next. The future, though still uncertain, was something they would create together. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm glow over their small cottage and the fields they had tended to with love and care, Aveline felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. The journey had been long, but it had led her here, home. The moon hung low in the sky, its silver light casting a soft glow over the village. Aveline stood at the edge of the small clearing, watching the quiet scene unfold before her. The world seemed so still, so peaceful, and for the first time, she felt at peace with it all. It had been years since she had left this place, years since the curse had twisted her life into a series of heartbreaks and misunderstandings. But now she had returned not as the broken woman who had fled in shame, but as someone who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past. Elias stood beside her, his presence a comforting constant in a world that had once seemed so full of uncertainty. His hand found hers, and Aveline squeezed it gently, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. Together, they had faced the world, each other's strength in times of doubt, each other's joy in moments of triumph. And in this quiet moment, standing in the place that had once held so much pain, Aveline realized that she had come full circle. She had faced her past, uncovered the truth, and finally freed herself from the shadows that had haunted her for so long. But there was something more, something that had been growing in Aveline's heart over the past few years as she had settled into this life with Elias. She had come to realize that the love she shared with him wasn't just the love of a woman who had been healed by time. It was a love that had been forged through their shared struggles, through the ways they had healed one another, and through the unwavering belief they had in each other's strength. It was a love that had allowed her to reclaim her sense of self, to accept who she had become, and to forgive herself for the things she could never change. And now, as she looked around at the village that had once shunned her, she felt no anger, no resentment. Instead, she felt a quiet compassion for the people who had once feared her, who had turned away because of a curse that wasn't even her own. She had spent so many years running, hiding from the past, but now, in the stillness of the night, she understood that her healing wasn't just about moving on. It was about finding peace with everything that had happened, about accepting that the path she had walked had led her to this moment, and that she was stronger for it. Aveline turned to Elias, her heart swelling with the love that had filled every corner of her life since he had entered it. "I used to think that my past would define me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That the curse would always be a part of who I was, that I would never be able to escape it. But now I see that it was just a part of my story. It doesn't have to control me anymore." Elias smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "You've always been more than what happened to you," he said, his voice steady and full of love. "The past doesn't define you, Aveline. You do." Her heart swelled at his words, and for a moment she allowed herself to let go of the last remnants of doubt that had once clouded her vision. Elias had shown her that love was not just something to be received. it was something to be given, and in giving it, she had found herself. It was as if the love they shared had been the final piece to a puzzle she hadn't even known she was trying to complete. And now, as she stood beside him in the quiet of the village, with the moonlight bathing them in its soft glow, she knew that this was where she was meant to be. She had finally found home, not in the place she had once called home, but in herself, in the love she shared with Elias, and in the strength she had found through it all. The curse that had once defined her was no longer a part of her story. She had rewritten it, shaped it into something beautiful and strong. The past, with all its darkness, was just a chapter in a much larger story, a story that was still being written, and for the first time, Aveline looked ahead with no fear, only hope. With Elias by her side, there was nothing she couldn't face. The future was wide open, full of possibilities, and Aveline knew that whatever came next, she was ready, ready to love, to live, and to continue writing the story of her life, one filled with the strength, grace, and love that she had always deserved. Aveline's journey is a powerful reminder that we are not defined by the mistakes or trials of our past. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing that our history will always shape us, that the things we've been through will dictate who we are. But the truth is, we have the power to rewrite our story. Like Aveline, we can face our fears, confront the things that hold us back, and choose to move forward, stronger and wiser than before. The love and support we give and receive can heal even the deepest wounds, allowing us to rediscover our worth and rebuild ourselves from the ground up. In her story, Aveline learned that it's not about what has happened to us. It's about how we respond, how we rise after we've fallen, and how we learn to live fully without fear. It's about knowing that, no matter how broken we might feel at times, we can always find the strength to put ourselves back together. We are not our past. We are not our past. We are the future we create for ourselves. So, what's your takeaway from Aveline's story? How can you use her journey to inspire your own? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Where are you tuning in from today? We'd love to hear.